Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Majority Caucus, the Republican caucus in the Ohio Senate. And as one of our guests loves to say on Twitter, there it is. We have two big heavy hitters on the state and national political stages joining the President's Podcast today for the very first time, Bob Paduchik. He is the president of Agincourt Consultants. He is the former chairman of the Ohio Republican Party, the co-chair of the Republican National Committee, former co-chair of the Republican National Committee, and has run 4 winning Ohio presidential campaigns. Great to have you on the program. Also, coming back to the program, Frank Strigari, a nationally respected election law attorney and redistricting expert who works for ZHF Consulting in Columbus, Ohio. Great to have you guys back on the program. Well, there it is, saving democracy in Ohio during November's election. How big was the election for Ohio?
It was a great night in Ohio. Not only did we give a resounding victory for Donald J. Trump for president, 11 points, but, we got rid of Sherrod Brown, who was basically, the last remnants of whatever was a Democrat party in the state. So deposing him was a huge win. Bernie Moreno worked very, very hard, was diligent in his campaigning, very disciplined, ran a great campaign, and that was a very great win for us. And also sweeping the Ohio Supreme Court races, another big win for Ohio Republicans, and I think we can feel very proud about how the party did in the state.
And State Issue 1 went down to defeat after a $37 million campaign. On some of the prior podcasts, of course, you heard me quoting from Jim Provence's story. He's worked for the Toledo Blade for about now almost 30 years, and it basically said the Issue 1 campaign had $37 million. It had 2 former Supreme Court justices backing it. It had the endorsement of every major newspaper in the state, and it lost. In fact, it lost by nearly 8 points. And this was an overly confident crowd on the yes side, and the voters totally rejected the notion of their gerrymandering campaign.
Yeah, they sure did, John. And that's with $37 million, it will buy you a lot of things. It'll buy you a lot of votes, and it'll buy you a lot of people who will support you. But what it didn't buy, I think, was Ohio grassroots voters who saw this issue as it was, which was a partisan grab to try to retain and get seats for one political party, the Democrats here. And voters ultimately came to the conclusion that's not what they wanted. And you look at the language that was on the ballot, you look at the language that was being proposed to be put into the Constitution, they saw through it. And fortunately they did, because it was a win and a success for the state of Ohio in defeating that issue.
And as you said, Bob, the Supreme Court races went Republican. So you have basically one Democrat now left on the Ohio Supreme Court who made her whole campaign at the time about redistricting and gerrymandering, but didn't voters overwhelmingly reject the whole idea that Ohio is a gerrymandered state? Because if they bought into that, they would have elected Democrats to the state Supreme Court.
Well, look, a couple things on that. First, I want to point out that we haven't gotten the final finance report, so I'm going to expect that the other side, the Issue 1 folks, spent over $40 million. Yep. I think that's important to point out. The other thing I would say is, one of the reasons why they had a large base of support among Democratic Party was for decades, Democrats have been complaining about gerrymander. J.D. Vance gets elected to the United States Senate. It's because of gerrymandering. A lot of base Democrat voters don't know what it really is and don't understand it, but they know it's a bad thing. It's why Democrats lose races. When Allison Russo complains about gerrymandering every day of her tenure in the Ohio legislature, when the state Democrat Chairman David Pepper complains about gerrymandering and the reason why they can't win statewide elections or can't get anything done in Columbus, it becomes part of their ethos. And so that's, I think, one of the points that they were starting out with. But John, I think it's important for us to look at this in its totality, because I think there was a really big problem here that sort of gets glossed over. The other side mentions it in their campaigns when they said the Ohio Supreme Court 7 times ruled the maps unconstitutional. I think it would be good to unpack that, especially with Frank here, because Frank was in the state government when this was going on, and so just as a little bit of a primer here, back when I was state party chairman back in September of 2021, census data arrived very, very late. And because of the incompetence of the Biden-Harris administration. And so the apportionment board had 2 weeks to get maps by the deadline. And that was an extraordinary amount of time. I think they got zero credit for getting that done on time and presenting it. And what happened was, and if people don't remember this, but I remember this quite clearly, is those maps came out in the 3rd week of September, Frank?
Yes.
And then for 3 months, the Democrats on the Supreme Court and Maureen O'Connor did nothing. See, at that time, the court was 3 Republicans, Maureen O'Connor, a Republican in name, and then 3 Democrats. And those 3 Democrats and Maureen O'Connor drove the bus on all of those 7 Supreme Court decisions that got talked about in their commercials all the time. But here's the point that a lot of people may not have noticed or didn't pay attention to. They ran down the clock on purpose because they wanted to create chaos. So they didn't rule on this for 3 months. And then they ruled at the last minute, just how many days before the filing deadline, I don't remember, but it was a handful of days before the filing deadline, to throw this all into chaos. And Maureen O'Connor, in her opinion, and you can go back and read this, she said that she didn't really provide a fix. Sometimes the court will provide prescriptive measures for legislators or whoever to take, and they didn't provide that. They said, this is unconstitutional for these reasons and you need to fix it, but without any specific fix. And they did that 7 times. But in that first decision, I'd like to point out, Maureen O'Connor, with no purpose at all, a completely gratuitous act, said, we need to this needs to happen with a citizens commission. It shouldn't be done by legislators. It should be done by a commission of citizens that draw these lines. And then, lo and behold, 2 short years later, she's leading the $40 million campaign to put issue 1 on the ballot. I don't know how much money she made off of that. I don't know what they paid her. We saw her face on every single commercial they had. But somebody ought to investigate this, because there is a pattern here that looks almost like a conspiracy, starting in September of 2021, delaying the decisions from the Ohio Supreme Court, and then shooting down, creating chaos within the state of Ohio on these maps. And the last thing I would point to put the cherry on top, the current system worked when the Supreme Court wasn't backing the Democrats on this. You had a compromise, and it was a compromise that I might point out that resulted in these new maps that were constitutional, that had both Republican and Democrat input on them. Democrats picked up 2 seats in the House and 2 seats in the Senate in a year where Republicans won big. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to be answered for there. And listen, I don't know who bankrolled Maureen's campaign there. It was sort of the Maureen O'Connor vanity tour, but they ought to be pretty unhappy with how they wasted their money.
Having her front the campaign certainly was not convincing to voters either. Not a good spokesperson, right? But when you talk about, as he brought up, the 7, that was what they said over and over and over again. 7 times the maps were ruled unconstitutional. Well, if you just take the U.S. Supreme Court vacating the state Supreme Court's ruling on the congressional map and sending it back to the state Supreme Court and saying, you should really consider ruling on what the law says and what the Constitution says, right? So you can remove that. The map that we have is constitutional. And oh, by the way, wasn't it interesting, Frank, how quickly the NDRC and all these special interest groups then dropped their lawsuit? Mm-hmm. And why would they drop their lawsuit?
Because they knew that these maps were created in a way that was compliant with the Constitution. In those 7 decisions, which you just summed up very nicely what they actually were decisions about, the court made up the law. So it's hard to ultimately comply with the law and draw maps when you don't know what the law is. Being part of the actual team that put together the constitutional language in a bipartisan fashion that is now part of our Constitution, 10 years ago. There are many things that I recall, and many stories I recall about why language is written in one way or another. The Supreme Court abused that language that was jointly approved and unanimously approved by the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, and overwhelmingly approved by the voters of Ohio. So these 7 decisions that they always like to refer to that happened, not only are they not describing what those 7 decisions actually did, but they're talking about 7 decisions where the law was just being made up out of thin air.
Well, that is in fact what the panel, the 3-judge federal panel, ruled. I think it was page 51 regarding the House and Senate maps. The ruling basically said, or the opinion said, that the state Supreme Court O'Connor majority was using criteria not easily found anywhere in the Ohio Constitution.
They made up the law.
Making it up as you went along, trying to back it into the court drawing a map, which the court cannot draw a map. But if you remove the NDRC, that $40 million of money that comes into these types of campaigns attacking the Ohio Constitution, remove all of the pressure that the special interest groups put on state Democrats to just go along. If you remove all of that and you can negotiate in good faith, the process works.
It does work, and it did work last year when the redistricting commission unanimously, Republicans and Democrats, approved the General Assembly map that is currently in place. And so that goes exactly back to Bob's point, is that the root of the problem back in 2021 was census data information coming late. When you're under a time crunch of effectively 2 weeks to draw maps, very, very difficult thing. And Bob said it earlier, like, it's something actually, the commission should probably have gotten credit for coming up with the maps they did at that time, but they did not. Instead, they were getting blasted because of partisan outside groups that were coming in and basically wanting to sue to force the court 3-4 months later to try to put its hand on the scale of how the maps should be drawn, and that's what they were trying to do, but fortunately they weren't able to.
And you're the former chief legal counsel for the Ohio Senate, so you have great perspective on what that issue won, what that constitutional amendment actually said. And I felt that their campaign knew that they were in trouble when they felt the need to respond with their own news conference the next week after Senator Michelle Reynolds, former state representative John Barnes, who's a Democrat, and then, of course, Rebecca Zatella, the former chair of Michigan's so-called Independent Redistricting Committee, came to Columbus and held a news conference and talked about how it disenfranchised the black community. It disenfranchised minority voters because all proportionality did, based on what issue 1 was founded in, it forced the major cities to be divided dozens of times. In fact, the former state representative from Michigan, Sherry Gay Dignogo, talked about how Detroit was divided 22 times, and now the city of Detroit does not have an African-American representative in Congress. And I thought that really resonated, and then when the Issue 1 campaign felt the need to respond, I thought that the tide was definitely turning.
Well, and and you take it a step back a little bit even further, too, is that I think they started feeling compelled to respond when the ballot board said this is what this language does, and came up with ballot language that factually explained to the voters what this amendment did. And so the other side in the Yes campaign, was throwing a lot of stuff at the ballot language, but I think they were doing that because they were concerned how the voters were now going to know exactly what this ballot language and ballot amendment did. And that caused them a lot of concern, and they needed to start getting out there. And then after that, as the discussion continued to go on, it became well known to people that this was forcing gerrymandering into the Constitution, regardless of what the Yes on One campaign said. It was going to mandate it. It was going to force it. And the main way it was going to force it, John, was exactly how you explained it in our and those ladies up from Michigan explained it was going to break up the big urban districts and spread the voters out. And to me, that's called racial gerrymandering, and it's been that concept has been recognized by federal courts for about 60 years now.
And their first map was determined by a federal court to be a racial gerrymander. Yet, what has happened in the media in Ohio? I mean,
They're the big losers in this, John. I mean, they really are. I mean, you pointed it out in earlier here in the
every
program.
major editorial board came out and endorsed issue 1 and cheerleaded for it. And then even the Toledo Blade, and probably 3 weeks before their final endorsement of issue 1 came out. And on this program, we've even said they admitted the line was, there is an element of gerrymandering in issue 1, but they still turned around. Every major newspaper endorsed this gerrymandering campaign that was nothing other than a political power grab for the far left that was funded by, as you say, you think it's going to be more than $40 million coming from outside of Ohio, special interest groups that are attacking the Constitution. The media was rejected as much as issue 1 was.
100%.
How relevant are they now?
Well, they're not. And here's the thing about this is, they have the corporate media structure of the newspapers in this state, because I sometimes call them the corporate media, but let's just use a different term, a very good friend of mine, the fake news. I mean, Ohio newspapers have become the fake news, and it's really, really sad, because as they have taken these extreme left positions on these different things, they've alienated customers that would normally subscribe and be part of their news. But let me speak to it as, former chairman of the state party and as a Republican political consultant. If you're a statewide candidate and you go and do an editorial board, you ought to have your head examined, because you're not going to get a fair shake from the newspapers in Ohio.
More of them aren't.
Right.
More of them aren't.
And you won't see that happen. So they are less relevant. I love doing talk radio, and Mark Blazer's show on 610. He's a great guy. It has more influence than the Columbus Dispatch. No doubt in my mind about that. I don't say that just to make Mark feel good, but that's just a fact of the matter. They are so irrelevant to the process now because they have been so biased, and people recognize it. I mean, we submitted hundreds of letters to the editor, many of them that never got printed. We submitted op-eds. We ran a whole earned media campaign that was largely ignored as much as possible. The newspaper editorial boards were intellectually dishonest on this. And if you saw some of the post-election editorials that came out, somebody needs to do a wellness check on Tom Suddes, because I don't know what has happened to that guy, but he used to be a very well-respected and serious reporter. Now he's just like irrelevant now.
I'm amazed by not only the media on the editorial side, but now there's really no separation, as far as I'm concerned, between the editorial side and the newsroom based on what you see on social media.
Well, you make a good point, because I'm not talking about the reporters. I'm not talking about the people that a lot of us deal with every day. Those are good individuals. They're trying to do a job. They're in a tough spot because they got to deal with, they are not paid as well as they should be. They're overworked. They're in an environment now where they have to be careful about how they approach things and do things because of their editors and the editorial board. And so they're in a bad spot. So I have a lot of sympathy for them. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the boardrooms and the corporations that run the Dispatch, run the Plain Dealer. These guys, they're just, they're squandering an opportunity to provide a real public service, because we do need watchdogs.
Well, even Trump said that he doesn't want to see all the media go away, but they need to get back to the golden age of legacy media standard, where clearly there was fairness there on the editorial side, but the amount of cognitive dissonance and disconnect, and the Republican voters don't really know what they're doing. The Republican voters, they're so out of touch with the mainstream. No, it's actually the other way around, because that's why MSNBC is for sale. That's why the Washington Post is having to lay off people. I mean, that's why 30 million people watch the Joe Rogan podcast. Right? That's what is relevant now.
Because that's where they get their news. Right. Programs like this inform people, and you don't have to go through the newspapers anymore, because again, they're largely irrelevant. And here's the thing about this. One of the ultimate reasons why issue 1 failed in Ohio is it purported to be bipartisan. It was not. It was the League of Women Voters operation, and there's no more partisan organization than the League of Women Voters. They proclaim that they're somehow this public interest group. They're on every single lawsuit that the Democrat Party files on elections. What is it? Dozens of lawsuits in the last
over 20.
Yeah, in the last 10 years, they are a Democrat front group, and one of the things Republican county parties and I know the state party knows it, but a lot of the county parties got to realize is that local candidates should not give the League of Women Voters the time of day because they might as well just go sit down with the Democrat county chairman.
Yeah, I call them the League of Liberal Disinformation on the podcast.
The left-wing voters, whatever it is, they're a huge problem.
Well, and we saw this too when we were talking to the average Ohioan out there about their thoughts on on issue one. One of the most fascinating things that I have heard and seen in a long time was when you would just talk to them about like where they actually consume their news these days. And I'm telling you, like, I don't know, I cannot recall of a single voter that I talked to personally and heard from that said that I get my news from the Columbus Dispatch, the Plain Dealer, the Toledo Blade, CNN.com, FoxNews.com, any of that stuff. They get it from news, social media, in podcasts, and in these type of outlets that you're providing to people.
Well, we call it the Views the News Excludes for a reason, because there certainly was a palpable sense of us being censored if we were sending something over to one of the editorial boards, and you knew that they were not using the same metric against the Democrat members, right? They just accept whatever they sent them, but that wasn't the case for us. What do you think the importance of having Trump's landslide victory, not only in Ohio, but across the country, where you're talking about the popular vote, and we just talked about the disconnect of Democrat leadership, which is not the Democrat leadership of the 1980s or even 1990s for that point. But what do you think is the real message or mandate that came from election night with his win, and also the importance of having the next vice president being from Ohio?
Well, a couple things. So let me first start with President Trump. It's a huge win for him. The popular vote and 312 electoral votes, every single swing state he took. That is huge by any standard. And so you look at what matters to voters. So we did polling on issue one. And in that polling and in the focus groups, we found out the top 3 issues for Republicans and independents in Ohio. And although Ohio's a red state, I still think it's a good barometer for the country in general. Yes. But those top 3 issues were inflation, border security, and jobs in the economy. Okay? If you look at the Democrats, their top 3 issues, this was amazing to me. Their top issue was abortion, then inflation, and then health care. Now, we all know that the voters passed, a constitutional, put abortion in the Ohio Constitution, basically an abortion law that's as restrictive as North Koreans, and that is the law of the land here. For that to still be an issue among Democrat voters is very bizarre to me, and I think it demonstrates a disconnect here on where Democrat voters are, what their priorities are, and what the rest of the country's priorities are. And so we'll see how they deal with that. But look, J.D. Vance is vice president. I was with Bernie Moreno yesterday, the Ohio Manufacturers Association. So I'm giving him credit for this. It's like Ohio will have 3 senators because the vice president is the president of the Senate. And that's true. J.D.'s a very influential senator. He's going to be a partner with President Trump. He's going to get a lot of good things done. But he'll also be there to help Bernie Moreno and then whoever Governor DeWine appoints to take J.D.'s seat. So we'll have great representation in Washington, D.C.
Well, it's very interesting, too, when you see, again, the national media and the national Democrats trying to undermine cabinet choices, Elon Musk, the Department of Government Efficiency, which they said this week that Ramaswamy and Musk both said, well, we don't want this to be a permanent department, but we need to get the deep state, the bureaucracy, the $36 trillion national debt under control. And I think that resonates with, kitchen table voters.
100%, John. And again, the Democrats ought to be doing some soul searching. So we're going to find out in the next couple months. The first indication is going to be who they pick to be the head of the Democrat National Committee. That person's going to give you an indication. Are they going to continue to stay in this woke politics where it's a cavalcade of special interest groups that have grievances about every single thing? Are they going to be a party of grievances, or are they going to be a party about ideas and solutions? So we'll see that over the next several weeks, months, and get an idea there. But my guess is that that's not going to happen.
Well, we like to say that candidates, campaigns, and issues matter around here. So under the prior set of maps, there were 15 Senate districts that leaned Democrat. Republicans won 8 of those districts. So you had competitive races, and as you brought up, there were 2 Democrats who were able to win back seats through the redistricting process. That was a unanimous bipartisan vote for the maps for the current General Assembly that runs through the rest of the decade. Isn't it interesting, however, that just this week at the ballot board, an attorney from the Mark Elias law firm, which represents the NDRC, you've heard me talk about it a lot on this program, the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, that is funded by the tens of millions of dollars that we just saw that Issue 1 campaign ran on. Isn't it interesting to see them back before the ballot board, again pushing what they call the Voters' Bill of Rights?
It's not interesting. It's almost like I assumed that was going to be the case, and that was going to be their next move, because that's what they're trying to do, and they're pushing this concept of a Voters' Bill of Rights, which is the complete opposite of it. It's basically just their attempt to try to change the policy in the state when it comes to elections, by including one in particular, just for example, about eliminating photo ID requirements. Who's for that? 80% of the people in this country are for photo identification. So why would we want to undo it and say that you don't need it in our state constitution? It's because you have these national groups that are funded by and represented by Mark Elias's law firm, who want to come in, change the laws in the state of Ohio so that they can win more seats and manufacture more seats, which they wanted to try to do with Issue 1, which they failed. And I'm certain that if this issue and ballot issue will come on the ballot ultimately in the future, which I'm not really certain it will, but if it does, I'm pretty confident that the voters of Ohio are going to reject that once again, too.
And let's be clear about this. They know they can't win on ideas and policies. They can't win it through candidates and elections, so they subvert democracy. They did this in Michigan. They passed this Bill of Rights in Michigan. They passed the redistricting. They got rid of Republican advantages in their state legislature, so now it's all Democrat run. They have a Democrat governor, and that's what they do. They can't win it through the process, so they have to rig the system. And we see it in other states. Thank God it didn't happen here in Ohio. I got to give a lot of credit to the Chamber of Commerce, Ohio Manufacturers Association, many of the other groups that got involved and got behind this campaign. Speaker Johnson, Leader Scalise in the Congress, the Ohio congressional delegation. Got to give a lot of credit to Matt Huffman and Rob McCulley, because they were the sort of the genesis of the campaign.
And the governor was in his.
And Frank's 100% right. Governor's leadership, the press conference that had done where he laid out the predicate that this would be gerrymandering in the Constitution, which is 100% correct and factual, was a turning point for us. That gave us an opportunity. That put us in the game.
And he was the one who that first effectively pointed that out to the public and said, this is going to require gerrymandering. And that led in a lot of ways to what we heard of the conversation turn to over the next ensuing months, and the voters of Ohio appreciated and understand that. And I want to give credit to Bob Paduchik, too, because Bob Paduchik was somebody who obviously led a great campaign in the state of Ohio with, all those other individuals, of course, that you were referring to. But this is someone that I think, honestly should be commended for his work that he's done for the state and on this issue.
Well, the Republican Party was definitely unified, right, with President Trump's message as well.
Chairman Alex Triantafilou did a great job. There was a lot of grassroots activities, the bus tour, the yard signs, the talking points, everything. So let's get this stuff out of the way because this is important. We got to thank the governor. He has a huge megaphone, and his voice mattered. He made a real difference in this. We got to thank our legislative leaders like Matt Huffman and Rob McCauley. We got to thank our congressional delegation, but we also got to thank Alex Triantafilou with the state party. This was all about making this a red shirt, blue shirt thing that Republican voters needed to know. And here's the results of that. You want to know why that was effective? Trump won 81 of Ohio's 88 counties. The no vote on issue won 80 of Ohio's 88 counties. And that right there shows you that this was a grassroots effort. We got outspent 5-1, but it was a grassroots effort that Republican voters understood that this was a Democrat attempt to rig the system. It's a big part of our playbook there. It was successful. And I think when these other measures keep popping up, these guys want to spend $6 to $8 million to get on the ballot. Great. They want to drop $40 million on a Maureen O'Connor vanity tour. Great. We'll be ready to come after these guys with the facts. And now the most important thing is our team knows that we can defeat this out-of-state dark money, even if we get outspent 5-1.
And just like I said in the beginning, too, $40 million cannot buy the grassroots. The grassroots, once they know and are educated about issues like they were on issue 1, they can come in and spend $80 million if they want to, but the grassroots will ultimately always win the game.
Yeah, this coastal money just keeps on coming.
It's not just coastal, John. It is foreign dollars.
Which we finally banned those foreign dollars. After a major fight with Democrats that said it wasn't happening, it's not happening, and then there was a lawsuit. Well, why would Mark Elias's law firm have to file a lawsuit challenging the law if you weren't using foreign dollars?
100%. It's the same reason why they file lawsuits on ballot boxes, because they want these remote ballot boxes where you can drop off, where nobody's monitoring it. They do that because they want to commit mail fraud. They want to get rid of voter IDs. The only reason you want to get rid of voter IDs is because you want to give people an opportunity to cheat. And on and on the reporters say, well, there's no real evidence of voter fraud. Proving voter fraud on mail-in ballots is almost impossible to do. You almost have to catch somebody in the act. Now, sometimes they do, but it isn't very often. But that's the problem. Jimmy Carter ran a commission, and he talked about this was the most dangerous thing for democracy for us to rely on mail-in ballots. In states where that happens, they have real big problems with their elections.
Well, it's only happening a handful of times, kind of like gangs taking over apartment complexes in Colorado. It doesn't happen that often. One time is too many for that kind of thing. One time of voter fraud is too many. And really, what I used to think was hyperbole. I was like, this is just a bunch of propaganda out there. It's not really happening. Now you see it. You can witness it firsthand that it is happening. And it really is an attack on democracy, because you have to have an ID to buy beer at the grocery store. And I always tell the kid at the counter, just turn 21 as I show my ID. But the left doesn't want people to have to prove who they say they are at the ballot box, which is the foundation of our government and our democracy.
Well, not only does it allow people to break the law, but it disenfranchises every legal voter. Every voter that follows the law and casts a single ballot gets disenfranchised when somebody cheats, when somebody that's not a citizen registers and votes, when somebody votes more than once, when somebody stuffs a ballot box. It disenfranchises every American citizen that's following the law.
Well, and it's funny because when they make that claim, well, it's only 5, 10, 15 claims that I commend Secretary LaRose. He's doing a fantastic job about exposing those people. But they're like, that's a small number. This is coming from the same people, and when I say the same people, the same Democratic organizations and attorneys in many ways who I recall many years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, always arguing in every case that every vote matters. Every person's vote should be counted. Every person. Well, apparently, 5, 10, 15 people who are committing voter fraud, disenfranchising the electorate, and sometimes disenfranchising individual voters. That's okay. We'll just look beyond that because we don't think there needs to be photo ID. Their arguments just so always are going to conflict with one another, and it's pretty telling that that's the case.
And people think I'm funny when I call these folks Bolsheviks, but this is exactly what the Bolsheviks did during the Russian Civil War. This is exactly what happens. They undermine our institutions. They try to cheat. They try to rig things. They don't follow the rules. And it's a disservice to the country.
They accuse their opponents of doing the exact same thing that
they
100%
are doing.
That projection is a core part of their beliefs.
One final thought. You talked about it a little bit earlier at the start of the podcast, but for both of you, Ohio a red state?
Oh, it is now. Yeah. I think so. I mean, 4 years ago, wouldn't think it's the case. But when Trump came back, the campaign spent $0 here in Ohio. We had a state director, Garrett Arnold, did a great job, but there wasn't like a huge investment in the Buckeye State, and we increased the numbers to an 11-point victory. Again, it's and there's two reasons why Ohio's a red state. One, a Democrat Party, starting with the Obama administration, that is focused on woke social justice issues that independents and average voters really don't care about.
Not steel workers, not car
exactly.
makers.
It used to be a voice. It used to be a voice for working families. The Democrat Party stopped doing that under the Obama administration, and they have not found that voice again yet. At the same time, Donald J. Trump ran for president on a working class conservative message about dealing with trade deals, about making things in this country again, about taking a tough chance not just with our adversaries like China and Russia, but also getting our allies in line. Now, that is a picture-perfect message for Ohio, and we've seen both, Governor DeWine and the legislators here in Ohio understand that dynamic in the state. And so what you have is a perfect working class conservative representation. And I think that means until the Democrats figure out how to reach back to working class voters, they're not going to be able to do this. Now, I will say this. I saw Dontavius Geralds, the assistant minority leader, just got elected. Congratulations to him. But he was on State of the State last week, and he was talking about the bathroom bill. I mean, the Democrats seem obsessed about these issues. Now, that doesn't mean those issues aren't important and have to be dealt with by the legislature, but that's all the Democrats talk about. And they have become a political party that is governed by a cavalcade of grievance groups that feel like they've been displaced or dishonored or whatever, however you want to characterize it. But that's not the formula. A party should be about ideas and solutions for governance to make Americans' lives and Ohioans' lives better. And until they get back on that message, they're going to continue to fail and lose elections.
Yeah, it's all identity politics and class warfare with them. I like to call them the elitist, the entitled, and the always offended.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I completely concur with Bob. I think Ohio is definitely a red state, and I believe, and honestly, ultimately started in 2016 when Donald Trump, was elected president of the United States. And why was that in particular? Because, John, as you well know, growing up in that area, like as I like to call it, the East Coast of Ohio was, for how many decades, Bob? Like it was blue. I mean, it was always blue.
Yeah.
In that election that year, it basically became red, and it's been that ever since. And I think that's why we're now seeing Ohio continuing to elect statewide elected officials who are Republicans, who are doing the people's work and not focusing on these issues that the Democrats seem to be focused on. And I do think that Ohio continues to always be a bellwether of how the rest of the country is trending. And I'm hoping, at least, and I'm thinking that I think the rest of the country will follow that same path and become more red, as a lot of states are even showing us to.
There it is. Follow Bob Paduchik on X, the old Twitter. Same thing with Frank Strigari. Gentlemen, thanks for all the fantastic perspective and insight, and we look forward to having you back.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.